responsibility towards non-human animals. But is it really so hard for us to know what we should do? The science is very clear. To avoid disastrous global warming, the nations of the world must begin immediately to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and continue to do so rapidly. We have a good idea of how much emission reduction each developing economy needs to commit on the basis of some fairly straightforward ethical principles, and we also have a pretty good idea of how soon large developing countries will have to follow suit. We already have a widely agreed set of principles to guide global action as embedded in the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been ratified by virtually all nations, including the United States. The Kyoto Protocol elaborated on those principles and was likewise agreed to by all nations in 1997, including the United States, although, of course, in a display of bad faith, the United States, and for several years Australia, later reneged on its commitment. We know with certainty what must be done to avoid enormous harm, particularly to poor and vulnerable people around the world. A task rendered less onerous by the fact that all economic studies show that the transition to a low carbon energy system could be achieved at modest economic cost. Rather than creating a perfect moral storm, it seems to me that the ethical winds blow strongly in one direction. It's true, as Stephen Gardner writes, that the debate is plagued by what he calls moral corruption, quote, the subversion of our moral discourse to our own ends. Yet moral corruption prevails, not because the situation is inherently murky, but because confusion has been deliberately sown, and because the public and political representatives have sought reasons to shirk their ethical obligations. There are three kinds of actors in this process of moral subversion: those who tell their lies, those who repeat the lies, and those who allow themselves to be seduced by the lies. First, what of those who tell the lies? Moral confusion has been created by a well-funded and clever campaign launched in the 1990s aimed at casting doubt on the science of climate change. The strategy was developed in the United States, implemented by conservative think tanks, and funded largely by fossil fuel interests. The history of this campaign and its effects have now been carefully documented and explained, not least by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway in their book Merchants of Doubt. More recently, earlier this year in fact, the vast sums of so-called dark money that continue to flow into the denial machine have been documented in forensic detail by Robert Bruhl, an American sociologist. The campaign has been highly effective, and since then it's been exported from the US to other countries, notably Australia, and in particular to Anglophone nations. The campaign to deny climate science turned global warming into a battleground of a wider cultural war. So, surveys in the United States show that among those who dismiss climate science, 3/4 describe themselves as conservative and only 3% as liberal, with the rest describing themselves as moderate in their political views. If you look back at the surveys that were conducted in the 1990s, before this campaign funded by the fossil fuel companies and prosecuted by right-wing think tanks and other conservative outlets in the United States, before that took hold and had its impact, if you look at the survey results, there was no difference in the mid and late 90s in views of Americans on global warming by political allegiance. Republicans and Democrats had the same views. The tactics used by think tanks, corporations and foundations in the climate science denial movement have been exposed in a large number of books and articles, sometimes based on the release of secret documents through court actions. And these tactics, and my list to follow has also been, or similar one has been compiled by a US legal academic, Donald Brown. The list of tactics include communicating to the public statements that are flagrantly untrue, cherry-picking data from climate science papers and reports to give an erroneous impression of their results and to undermine their validity, hiding the sources of funding to think tanks that carry out work that discredits climate science, and I might note all of these apply Fly in Australia and the Institute of Public Affairs, which is the principal source of climate denial in Australia, also keeps very secret its sources of funding. Creating front groups in order to conceal their backers and intentions. Same things happened in Australia. The Waubra Foundation, the Australian Environment Foundation are examples. Sullying the reputations of sincere scientists. Any number of Australian climate scientists can tell you how attempts have been made to sully their reputations. And lastly, intimidating and threatening scientists and others who speak out with a view to driving them from the public debate. These tactics involve deception, misinformation and coercion, all of which are ethically reprehensible. Yet, when something of immense importance is at stake, and what could be more important than the survival of the most vulnerable of the Earth's citizens in the face of famine, flood and epidemic, when so much is at stake, we owe an absolute allegiance to the truth and must put aside any ideological or financial discomfort that the truth may raise. Hiding this truth is the essential moral failing of those who deny the science of climate change. So much for those who tell the lies. What of those who repeat the lies? Well, in addition to those who manufacture them and engage in various deceitful strategies to undermine climate science, there are some who amplify the lies and contribute to the smearing of scientists for political or personal reasons. Collectively, they're sometimes known as the echo chamber and include newspaper editors and columnists. I know the name that came to all of your minds. Prominent bloggers, politicians and influential public figures. Such people, of course, claim to be speaking the truth. Reading their contributions to the debate, one is struck by the absolute conviction they hold that their stance is the only ethically defensible one. But, as in all instances where an understanding of a complex issue requires advanced expertise, those without training must decide not what to believe, but whom to believe. In this case, we are obliged to accept the verdict of those most qualified to deliver it, that is, those recognised within the community of scientists as the experts with the best knowledge and insight. And that status, of course, is achieved through successful participation in the system of peer-reviewed research published in professional journals, which we know overwhelmingly endorses the main propositions of human-induced climate change. Yet some prominent individuals, with no expertise whatsoever, deem themselves capable of overruling the vast consensus amongst the qualified scientific researchers, and so they overrule it in order to prosecute a set of beliefs that have been rejected by every scientific academy in the world and have been systematically debunked by legitimate scientists. The Australian Cardinal George Pell, recently appointed to a senior administrative position in the Vatican, is a prominent case. In various speeches and newspaper articles, Pell has condemned established science and reproduced manifestly untrue, culled from various websites, claims made by people with no credibility as climate scientists and who are unwilling to submit their claims to the established processes of professional review. To explain away the consensus of opinion among qualified climate scientists, Pell resorts to conspiracy theories, suggesting that the IPCC is keeping certain statistics secret and that a, quote, small, tight-knit group of computer modelers is suppressing contradictory evidence. As a man of the cloth, Cardinal Pell has a particular obligation to tell the truth, especially as some Catholics believe that he would not mislead them. It should be said, as a coda, that against Cardinal Pell's fervent rejection of science, the Vatican has come down firmly on the side of science. What of the third and much larger category, those who are seduced by the lies? The denial campaign would not have been as influential if it had not cast the seeds of doubt on such fertile soil. Most members of the public in the United States and here in Australia, and particularly in the Anglophone countries, while not explicitly disavowing the science of climate change, and that's still the case in the US, have nevertheless deployed various psychological strategies to remove its sting. This kind of casual denial relies on such inner narratives as environmentalists always exaggerate, Didn't those leaked ClimateGates emails show that it's all a bit dodgy? And I'll worry about it when the scientists make up their minds. Anxiety about the facts of climate science can be reduced simply by restricting exposure to upsetting information. I mean, we all do that, don't we? When something horrible famine comes on the television, we turn away unless we make a conscious decision to have a kind of strength to know, watch it and face up to it and recognise the horrible truth. But frequently we reduce our anxiety and our distress by excluding the facts that upset us, a kind of selective disengagement. The desire to disbelieve is activated by news outlets each time they give undue prominence to stories that create the impression that climate scientists cannot agree, or that the science is politically tainted. The Australian newspaper has campaigned systematically that way over several years, persistently publishing opinion pieces by climate deniers. They had another one the other day from a senior person appointed by senior business advisor to the new government. The Australian consistently publishes alleged news stories about scientific reports that systematically distort the message of those scientific reports and those scientific articles. And what the Australian and other news outlets do, particularly Murdoch-owned news outlets, is pander to this desire by many in the public to disbelieve the uncomfortable facts communicated to them by climate scientists. So the public uses self-deception to good effect. We tell ourselves humans have solved these kinds of problems before, or it's unfortunate, a lot of poor people in poor countries are going to suffer, but it won't affect me much. Alternatively, as a psychological strategy, we might divert attention from anxious thoughts and unpleasant emotions by engaging in minor behaviour changes, like switching to low-energy light bulbs. Actions that help mollify feelings of helplessness and guilt. Perhaps the most widespread method of avoidance, however, is the practice of wishful thinking. Cultivating what the psychologist Shelley Taylor has called benign fictions can be in everyday life a comforting strategy in an often unfriendly world. I mean, which one of us hasn't, got a devastating set of referees' comments to a paper we've submitted, or overheard some nasty comment about our personal failings, and then over the next hours, days, reconstructed our sense of goodness by cultivating these benign fictions. Yet, such fictions become dangerous delusions when they are clung to despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The climate debate is rife with wishful thinking, such as the idea that technology will save us. Faith in carbon capture and storage and various geoengineering schemes are prominent examples of this kind of thinking. We cling to hope that something will save the day no matter what the evidence, such as the evidence might put up about where global emissions are tracking and have been tracking for some years. We cling to hope no matter what. We prefer to remember that Martin Luther King proclaimed, "I have a dream," and do not want to be reminded that in a more reflective mood he also wrote, "In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late." In rich countries, the panoply of psychological devices citizens use to deny, dilute or distance the facts of climate science serve to absolve them of moral responsibility to avoid self-censure. And this enables them to carry on with their lifestyles and vote for governments that don't take global warming seriously. This kind of moral recklessness is perhaps a natural human failing, one that historically has been overcome by strong leaders whose moral clarity brings out the best in others. We all have a duty to the truth. A minority of citizens, quite small in most countries, has faced up to the full truth of climate change. Among scientists, they include James Hansen and Kevin Anderson. These citizens, not just scientists but plenty of others of course, are distinguished not necessarily by more advanced ethical sensibility, but by the fact that they do not allow themselves to use the various escape mechanisms that others have relied on. In other words, they exercise moral courage. If we look around our universities, we see that, in contrast to the view who have admitted the facts, most intellectuals who, at some level, know the truth of climate change and would never challenge any of the propositions of climate science, nevertheless act as if it's merely an abstraction. Some continue to write futuristic books without mentioning that the Earth will be profoundly transformed by warming, as if the dire warnings of the scientific of the scientific academies and any number of Nobel Prize winners are some kind of peculiar obsession restricted to the scientists. So, in sum, and to conclude, I just want to say that at a time when the scientific case for strong action has become unassailable, the subversion of the moral discourse by those who tell the lies, by those who amplify them, and by those who are seduced by them, has become so pervasive that it's taken us outside of the normal moral discourse. The world has to accept moral responsibility before it can make ethical judgments. Before we can wrestle with an ethical dilemma, we must accept that we are responsible moral agents. Humanity's ethical impulse has been receding as the call for it has become ever more clamorous. We are not confused, we are weak, and will respond to the warnings when we find, from somewhere, the strength to do so. Thank you.
We will now welcome John Dryzek. John is a centenary professor in the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the Anzog Institute for Governance at the University of Canberra. Before that, he was a distinguished